First question.
Okay, first question. I didn't see this on my list, surely. Anyway, Sister Gigi, what was your first impression when you met PD for the first time? I forgot. No, it's not true. Actually, the very first time I met Dave, I thought he was a really nice person. He was a really good man. I've met a lot of different kinds of pastors and missionaries and people who don't know the Lord, but I think Dave was the very first person that I met who I felt very comfortable to just spill out all my guts. I felt very safe with him and felt I could trust him. So that was
Single
my first
guys, take note. Pickup lines don't work. Be a nice guy. Yeah? You don't want a girl who can be got with a pickup line. All right, good. All right. How do you resolve our arguments with your child? Well, our daughter's not a child anymore, but we did have arguments with a child. We have family rules, no shouting on either side. Obedience is important. Respecting each other is important. And we try and resolve every situation through discussion. And there are boundaries in the discussion. You're not allowed to take things outside of the area. If you're discussing, we do this, we don't do this, things like that. You can't say, yeah, well, what about last week? That's not allowed. That doesn't have anything to do with that. And the rules apply both ways. Somebody was asking me a question last night about, shouting, and I said we didn't allow our daughter to do shouting, and we're not allowed to shout to her. And there were times, it helped me learn to control my temper better, because there were times when my daughter was like 6 or 7 years old, and I'd raise my voice a little bit, and she said, Daddy, don't shout at me. And I would realize I was losing control of my temper. Let me just say something to you, or parents, especially if you have little ones. Listen. Teach your children to be obedient to the rules. Don't discipline your kids unless they do something wrong. Many times parents discipline kids because the parents are upset. They're mad at something the kid did that wasn't wrong, but maybe, or especially they're feeling embarrassed by their kid. You teach your children the difference between right and wrong. And right and wrong is not about you. It's not about making you happy. Sometimes kids try really hard to be cute and do something naughty at the same time, and the parents are, well, that's naughty, but they're so cute, it's okay. No, it's not okay. There's a right and there's a wrong in this world, and you teach that to your kids. And part of that means that you may be upset, you maybe had a bad day, you can't take it out on your kids. And so you teach them what's right and what's wrong.
Amen.
Why do you think there's so many mental health issues surfacing lately? Number one, I think it's because we understand mental health issues better. But I also think, and this is kind of a scary thing to me, you know the bit about the canary in the mine, that the miners would put a canary in a cage and they would take it because the canaries they react easier to poisonous gases and things like that. And when a canary would, in a cage, drop over and die, the miners would run and get out. I think that there's some things going on in our modern world that are like canary lessons to us. I think that we see a rising incidences of mental health, and we see rising incidences of other kinds of problems. And I think that Christians, as in part, and society as a whole, needs to ask ourselves, where are we going, and why are these problems created? I am not at all a person who's an alarmist or anything else like that, but there are some fair questions to ask about some of the things that are happening in the world and the consequences of those events. And so I think part of it is understanding. I'm so thankful we understand certain things about mental issues and mental health issues, but part of it is our society is creating some of those things. Let me give you an example. There's so many problems in America of people obsessed with media and imitating media in their lives and doing bad things because they saw somebody else who did it. Therefore, idolizing terrible things like murderers and things like that. And we need to ask ourselves this question about media. Is this really right that we allow media to have that influence? So that's my answer. Will IES combine all the venue churches and be a mega church? You want me to answer that?
Yes.
All right. So the reason we have different venues, and venues is a good word, we struggle with what word to use, is really because there's places that it's easier for people to come and to go to. So the reason we started one in the South, we started one in the Northwest, we started one in the West, we started one in Kalapagating. Now 2 of those churches have planted churches in Pick. So in all total, there's like 7 IES churches. The IES in the South, they changed a lot of things about their church. They rebranded. We don't consider them an IES church anymore, but we consider them like a sibling of us. They're our friends, and we rejoice in what the Lord does. But they have made some substantial changes of governance and things like that, so they're not an IES anymore. But the whole point in having them, all of them, is for people to be able to have access to a church that they can go to. So when IES first started, we were all in Wisma 46. We had people coming from beyond Karawaci. We had people coming from Bogor. We had people coming from beyond Cikarang. So we were drawing in people from a space that was, 45 kilometers, 60 kilometers. It was a huge area. And I was so thankful that there were people, for instance, in Cikarang, that would come all the way to IES. We even had a life group there of 20, 30 people. I was so happy, but I realized 2 things. Number one, it was always a strain for them to come. And number 2, if they brought their neighbors to the Lord, it would be really unlikely that their neighbors would want to go all the way there, So that's why we started churches in all those areas, and that's still our purpose. Megachurch technically is a church of like 2,000. 2,000 average weekend attendance and blah, blah, blah. IES, we've been over 2,000 before. We're under 2,000 now. It's not our goal. It's not our purpose. The traffic is bad. To try and bring everybody into one place doesn't make a whole lot of sense. The bigger the place, the more expensive it is. Now, it's possible that we might, on occasion, in the future, ask all the churches together for a special event. We've done that in Christmas, and even all the English-speaking churches sometimes. And we can do that, but it's not for the purpose of mega. It's for the purpose of fellowship. So, it's a great question. Thank you. All right, dear, you want to go first on this one?
What's your opinion on gay marriage? God's design is for a man and a woman to be married. So people who are on a relationship where there's the same sex, they are out of God's design, but it doesn't mean we don't love them or we hate those kinds of people. I think it's very important to separate those two, that we don't condone what they're doing, but we also don't separate them from us. It's like them and us. We have a calling first and foremost for us to reach out to those who don't know the Lord. And I pray for people like that. I personally have friends who are in that kind of relationship, and I love them and I pray for them daily. So,
I guess my biggest opinion on it, number one, I have to say that we always here have to obey the laws of Indonesia. So the issue on gay marriage in Indonesia is decided by the government. Same as religion between different people, different faiths, and everything else. We obey the laws. Now let me tell you what I feel. I really feel it's tragic in our world and society today that people are defined by their gender attraction. As Christians, we need to believe and understand that our calling is to live a life that's pleasing to God, and it has nothing to do with our attractions sexually. We are far, far more than sexual beings. And so to suggest that certain people are of a certain community and all of the people in that community have this thing in common, to me, it's belittling, it's negative, it's harmful to people. That's why I have an objection. Many of you know, with the long string of alphabets, the L, G, B, Q, T, R, S, V, P, and all that kind of stuff, X, Y, and it's all plus. Look, folks, these are all issues that people deal with that have to do with their sexuality, both the way they express their gender and the way that they are attracted to people sexually. And these are all separate issues. And you know, you're talking to somebody who's done a lot of study, a lot of reading. I understand that, for instance, I understand, for instance, that transgenderism is a different thing from people who identify themselves as people who have an attraction for wearing clothing of the opposite sex, and then that those people, for instance, cross-dressers, for instance, are sometimes cross-sexually oriented, and sometimes they're heterosexually oriented. And, you know, there's an enormous thing, but people should never be defined by their attractions. So when I'm asked this question, how do you feel about gay marriage? Let me tell you how I feel about marriage. Marriage should be between two people who are a man and a woman, because that seems to be what God has told us. We have no evidence from the Bible that there's any other plan. And these two people commit themselves to each other for life, and they learn how to love for each other and care for each other. And that's true whether it was an arranged marriage, whether they fell in love and dated for 10 years, whether they met on the train and got married in Vegas the next day, whether one is young and one is old, whether one is really good looking and one is questionable. Well, you know, all of these different kinds. People say, what was the deal with you and Sister Gigi? And I always tell them, we were both interested in kind of the same thing. I was interested in quality and she was interested in quantity, you know, and it just kind of worked out. But when you ask me this question, it's really important for you to understand. We do not believe that anybody is their sexuality. They're a full human being, and their sexuality does not define them. And then we need to start that conversation and go from there. And it may be a good topic for a sermon series in the future. But anyway, I'll just stop there because we'll keep on going. You want to answer that? How do we help someone get out from a toxic relationship? You've got to be really careful, because the tendency is if somebody's in a toxic relationship, they don't really recognize it. So sometimes you have to do an intervention when they get to a really complicated or really, really difficult place. Interventions on a relationship is really hard. It's much easier to get involved with somebody who has, for instance, a drug addiction or something like that, because you can actually, in a confrontation, you can actually challenge them and make them understand they're addicted. In a toxic relationship, it's really hard. Often if you try and take them and rescue them from the toxic relationship, it drives them even more into the other relationship. The best way to do it is to pray. And then, you know, if you want some help, contact us in the church. We'll see what we can do to help you, because there's a lot of different kinds of things. So we'll just end it right there. So, All right. What point or age should children be allowed to legally 21 or biblically make important decisions in their life? I think that's a really good thing for people to think about and talk about. My wife and I kind of decided, we told our daughter when she was younger, when you're 16, we'll begin to let you make certain kinds of decisions. You know, we had a question last time about clubbing and teenagers and stuff. The Jakarta teenage culture is very alcohol-oriented. It's very drug-oriented. It's very clubbing-oriented. It's a very common practice. And by the way, let me say, on behalf of the teenagers of Jakarta, I am really aware of the dangers, but if parents go clubbing and parents drink excessively, don't expect your kids to do anything different. All right? I'm just being honest. Yeah? If your kids see you come home wasted from a club, don't think that they're not going to want to go. And so I throw that in. Okay, so we chose 16, and we talked about the decisions she could make. I think the kids are in some ways more mature in their understanding of issues, but in some ways less mature, because peer pressure is bigger in them. So I would hate to give an answer. Biblically, they're adults when they're 12. And that may be a little bit too early for most of us to accept. So that's kind of hard to go. So each child is different, but have that discussion with your kids and explain to them the process by which they get to make certain decisions. Like when they're little, when do they get to decide what they do and don't want to eat? When they're getting older, when do they get to decide when they go to bed? When do they get to decide what clothes they want to wear? When do they get to decide, you know, different things like that? You have those discussions with your kids so they're involved all along, and you'll get a better sense of their ability and responsibility level. Okay. Complicated question. The modern church is of two thoughts on Halloween. I grew up before the church ever questioned Halloween. So I grew up with being in a costume every year. My most effective costume, I won awards for being a pencil sharpener. And I was a very good pencil sharpener. The problem was I had to have my hand out like this the whole time, in order to be the handle. I don't think being a pencil sharpener hurt me in any way, shape, or form, except maybe I've always been a little sharp. But anyway, on top of that, I say parents, use your wisdom. A lot of it, there's a lot of occult things, but they're all around. I'm not sure they're necessarily attached to Halloween. I think parents, think carefully, think about it, pray about it. If you have young kids, go ahead and talk to Pastor Mike. If you have teenagers, talk to Pastor Tirza, Pastor Josh. If your kids are not young teenagers or young kids, then it's probably too late to tell them when they're 35. So, okay. When does eating food become gluttony? What kind of question is that? I'm not offended at all. Okay. No, I'm serious. I'm not offended. It's good to have a question like that. Obviously, I'm overweight. That's obvious. And there are certain kinds of food that I like to eat. But let me just say something. If you understand the theology of gluttony, the theology of gluttony is not just about overeating, it's about undereating. The theology of gluttony is when a person allows consuming of food or drink, and in the Bible, gluttony is always attached to drunkenness. When they allow the consumption of food or drink, whether they excess or whether they refrain excessively. So people who in our modern world we would refer to as anorexic or bulimic or different things like that. The theology of gluttony that comes from the Catholic, Roman Catholic side of the church includes all of those things. Protestants, we don't really deal with the 7 deadly sins. There's a lot of stuff about stewardship and stewardship of your body. My ancestors were successful storers of calorie. So my ancestors survived the Irish famines by living on 1 potato for a week, and other people didn't. There was a question asked of me, and somebody said to me, he said, Pastor Dave, what's the difference between me having too much to drink and you having too much to eat? And I said, that's a fair question. Let me give you an answer. Nobody ever had 1 slice too many of pizza and went home and beat his wife. Nobody ever had 1 piece of cake too much and got in a car accident on his way home and killed anybody. So if you're going to draw moral equivalences between struggling with eating and overeating and all that, make sure you're doing it right. Okay? So like I said, in the New Testament, gluttony is always associated with drunkenness. That's not to suggest that overeating is not a problem. I acknowledge that. But let's not get carried away. So anyway, it's a good question. I'm not in the least bit offended, so don't worry about it. All right. You want to do that one?
Yeah.
All right. My husband and I are struggling to be together, but for some reason or another, the situations keep us apart. How do we work it out together? Change your situations. Usually the reasons that situations keep husbands and wives apart is because of work or family or health. And over a certain period of time, couples can accept challenges to their relationship on the basis of being able to go, to attain something like going to school for a degree, so you're separated from your spouse, or, But if your situation, like we're talking about jobs, get a different job. Because I promise you, when you end your life, you're not going to say, oh man, I wish I'd taken that job. You're going to say, oh, I wish I'd spent more time with my wife and my family. And so have a real understanding of the things that are important in life and seek those things. Change your situations. All right, this is really a good question, okay? If Jesus was a politician, what kind of government system and policies would he impose? The great question and the difficulty with this question was he was not and never will be a politician. He did not come to impose government systems, and he did not come to endorse policies. He came to redeem the souls of men and women. He came to express the love of God, to identify so that people in this world can know that there's a God who loves him. If you have seen me, you have seen the Father. What Jesus did for us does not have anything to do with political systems. He changes our hearts. And when our hearts are truly changed, we look at the political systems of our world, and as Christians, we say, we're going to embrace and pursue what is just and what is right. And often, we will have different opinions of what is just and right. But they need to come out of our conversion experience and our desire to follow God. And we can have great, wonderful Christians on both sides of the politics. C.S. Lewis talks about it in a war where there would be Christians on both sides shooting at each other. And he said, that's not necessarily a bad thing, as long as they're not good shots. That's my additional thing. But that's possible, that countries can have disputes and wars, and the supporters of both countries, their own countries, can be good Christians. Jesus was so far above politics that there's not even any realm. Good. Ask us some romantic questions. Yeah. Okay, God made us all, God created us all to love us. Ultimately, that's everything that comes from that. God made us all because he wanted to love us. He sent Jesus so we would know the Father and experience the Father's love, not just through the things Jesus said, but through what he did. He died on the cross for us. And people say, well, wait a minute, that's not really fair. And my answer is this. God sent his Son into the world so that his Son could surrender his life for us. And I promise you this. I love you all, but there's nobody in this room that I would let my daughter die for. Yeah. If any of you were dying and you needed to drain all the blood out of my daughter so that blood could be transfused in you and you would live forever, yeah, I wouldn't give up my daughter. In letting his Son die on the cross, God did something for us that is almost beyond imagination unless you're a parent. And when you're a parent, you can understand what it was, and you can understand how much he loves you. You want to answer this one, babe?
Sure. Is it against the Bible if someone does a plastic surgery to change the way he or she looks? It doesn't say in the Bible that you cannot do plastic surgery. Obviously, there's nothing written there. But I think there is a more serious issue when somebody wants to change their look. I think part of it, nowadays, looks is just something that is just like changing clothes. You want this type of clothes you want to wear, and I think there are stages to really completely changing yourself. I am not gonna stand in judgment on somebody who will completely change the way they look, whether it's through plastic surgery or anything else. I think there is something beyond, like I said, a deeper issue that goes on in somebody's mind for somebody to want to change, to want to change themselves. Obviously, it's something about the way they don't like the way they look, they don't like who they are, and somehow in changing their physical appearance would change also what they think inwardly, what they think of themselves. So personally, I don't stand in judgment. For somebody to change the way they look, it is their personal business, it is their personal preference. For me, I wouldn't, because they wouldn't let me.
No need, La.
But and I'm scared of knives, so.
All right, let's go on to the next question. Because there is no plastic surgery for... All right, next question. All right, PD, is Kanye West a good influence on Christians today? Is it better listening to him than other rap music like Eminem? Okay, let me say a couple things. First of all, I want to let all the teenagers know, relax. Because last week I said I bought the Kanye West album, and they were like, Pastor Dave doesn't know about Spotify. He doesn't know about Apple, Listen, my wife has like 7 or 8 or 9 albums as she did, and released in different places, released in Malaysia, released in the Philippines, one released in North America. And royalty is almost nothing from albums, right? And then on top of that, streaming music, those guys get paid like 10,000 people download the song and they get a penny from it. I bought an album because if he made an album about Jesus, I want him to at least make a couple bucks off of it. So that's why. It's not that I don't know about streaming music. Yeah, absolutely. This guy has surrendered his life to the Lord, and he's writing music about that experience. One of the best things I saw was somebody put on a picture on their timeline. They said, in all the years we've known this man, have we ever seen him smile this much? Right? Now, there's all this dialogue, and people are trying to be a little bit nervous because, some of us lived through the spectacular conversion of some other people, and people are saying, well, what if? Look, we don't want the church to sound like the elder brother who probably told his father, yeah, well, we welcome him back today, but next year he's going to run off again. Or the 99 sheep that were left behind who were probably complaining, that lamb runs away all the time. The good shepherd went to find them. Let's rejoice. Now, I think his music's pretty good, but I don't really like rap music. I also think Eminem's music's pretty good. I'm not necessarily going to compare between the two, but neither of them is near as good as Bruce Springsteen, so I'm praying for him to get saved. But that's just kind of a different era, different generation. It's good music, listen to it, but, pray for him because the pressure on him is enormous, absolutely enormous. He's doing, like this weekend, he's doing a Sunday church thing in Lakewood Church in Houston. And Lakewood Church is the church of Joel Osteen. So by going to Joel Osteen's church, the people who hate Joel Osteen are after him. The people who don't like Pentecostals are after him. The people who don't like African Americans are after him. And he's going to share the gospel with like 20,000 people. So what's to be mad about? Why? Seriously. Let's support this guy, all right? This is a really, really complicated issue because there are some branches of the church that would say this, that if you take your own life, you've therefore murdered, and you don't have a chance to repent, so therefore you've died with an unpardoned sin on your life. And we need to understand that we do not believe that we go to heaven to be with the Lord because we have never had an unpardoned sin on our life. You here, me here, every one of us here has things we've done that we have not specifically asked forgiveness for, sometimes because we forgot them, and sometimes because we're just stubborn. And if this place collapsed and we all died, we'd all go to be with the Lord. Because the issue is whether we have received and asked for his grace. So when a person takes their life, they do not put themselves outside of the grace of God. But let me say, when I get this question, often there are people who are either having a loved one who's taken their life or they're struggling with this themselves. And let me say to you that taking your life is not a good thing to do because you hurt other people. You don't make anything better. Now, if you know somebody who's struggling with that, we have opportunities to help you. And we have people in our church who struggle with it, so we don't want to make light of it or not think that it's serious. We want to pray because I do believe that there is a media fascination with this subject. And every time there starts to be some high-profile media exposure to people who have taken their own life, then we see streams of this kind of behavior. It victimizes people with mental health issues. And so we need to take it very seriously. As a Christian, we always put our hope and trust in the Lord. He decides when our life ends. We don't make that decision for ourselves. We value life because it's a gift from God. If you know somebody who's struggling with this issue, or struggling because they were associated with somebody who took their own life, contact me quietly, contact me by whatever needs necessary, and we'll arrange for counseling and help in that. Okay. When a couple is divorced and are both still alive as Christians and based on the Bible, can the divorced couple get married again? I'm wondering in this question whether you mean get married again to each other or get married again to other people. And I'm assuming it's the second. It's the second. Look, this question comes up a lot, and it's really important that we look at the issue of divorce and remarriage because we want to understand what the Bible really says about it. And I am not equipped to understand what marriage was all about in the culture and times of the day, though I do know a lot of the issues. Most Christians open the Bible and read what it says, not even understanding the basis for things. So let me give you a couple of things really quick, and I mentioned this in the last service. Probably 25 or 30% of the early church were slaves. And if you were a slave, the way you got married was Your owner had like 10 slaves, 5 men, 5 women. He had 5 rooms, and he put you in a room with somebody else, and that was your husband or your wife. There was no marriage. There was no ending of marriage. That was your husband or your wife. And 25% of the people in the church were like this. And that person was your husband and wife until your owner sent one of you away or moved you around because he didn't like the way somebody's behaving. In the Roman world, there was no certificate, there was no divorce process. So for Roman citizens, in the time the Bible was written, you married somebody by moving in with them. They were legally your wife or your husband, and you ended the marriage by moving out. When you were no longer living together, you were divorced. No legal process. So when people tell you like all this stuff about marriages, that they're assuming all of these things. Amongst the Jewish world that Jesus lived in his whole life, men could divorce their wives, and women could not divorce their husbands without going through extraordinary lengths from the elders and the priests to be able to do that. So it was a completely unfair kind of a situation. Now, one of the problems that we have is that people take a question that was asked to Jesus. I believe it's in Matthew 19 or Mark 19 or Luke 19 or, I'm kidding. There's no Mark 19. But it's in there somewhere. And Jesus has asked this question. Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any and every reason? That's not an isolated question. It's a question that was asked over and over and over between the rabbis because there was a great deal of discussion, and this was the issue. What has to happen for a man to divorce his wife? That's the question. Don't misunderstand. Is it lawful for a man for any and every reason? All right? The one extreme view was that a man who felt another woman was more attractive than his wife could divorce his wife because he was more attracted to somebody else. That's really seriously bad. And people believed that there could be other issues, and eventually there was a perspective that said it was pretty serious. He had to be a good husband and all this. But like if she did something really bad, like raise her voice at him, he could divorce her, right? So this is not a thing that's really good for women. And what does Jesus answer? Jesus' answer is, no, that's not what God's design for all this was. And then he goes on to say the only reason that you can divorce somebody is for this issue of sexual impurity. The word that's used to define it is the Greek word porneia, which is where we get the word pornography. It applies to different kinds of things. But what Jesus is essentially saying is the marriage commitment that you make should not be broken except for the violation of the one flesh covenant. But Jesus is not saying that divorce doesn't happen. In fact, he says Moses allowed divorce because of the hardness of your heart. So this is the problem. This question that we deal with today brings us into a situation where we're trying to apply cultural norms, cultural understanding, and legal understanding from 2,000 years ago into our world today. And the best answer is this. Number one, we're in favor of marriage. We're in favor of good marriages. We're in favor of husbands and wives being faithful to each other. We're in favor of husbands and wives not shouting at each other. We're in favor of them having that degree of faithfulness be established to give them a long life together. We believe in multi-generational Christianity. We want husbands and wives to raise kids who follow Jesus, who have good and healthy marriages. And good families and good marriages is what we're really in favor of. We recognize that these things do not always happen. And any time that there's a breakdown of a marriage for whatever reason, our desire is to help heal that marriage where there's healing possible, and where their healing isn't possible, then to help them choose the best way for them to live their life moving forward. There are so many possible permutations and combinations for anybody to make this hard and fast rule in this modern world and say, all divorce is right, all divorce is wrong, divorced people can't do this, divorced people can't do that. Let me throw something out for you. Do you know what part of the statement of divorce in under Jewish law is? Because this is the argument. Once you've been divorced, can you get remarried again? You know what it is? The statement includes the phrase, you are free to marry another, right? So to be divorced meant you could marry somebody else. So the discussion in the church world today of being married but not getting remarried, some of that comes from 1 Corinthians 7, and that needs to be dealt with and talked about. But it's a discussion that nobody in Jesus' community would have ever had, because they would have understood a divorced person can marry whoever they want. The issue is that they should marry somebody in 1 Corinthians 7. They should marry somebody in the faith. I think we probably need to have a little series on this, but concentrate on this, folks. We're in favor of good, strong, healthy marriages. And any two people who will work together can have a good marriage no matter what. And that's what we want. Okay, good. Want to do this one?
Sure.
You want to go first. Yeah.
Okay. PD, who will replace you as the lead pastor when you retire? I will. No. I'm kidding. Go ahead, PD.
All right, so this question was asked last night, and I answered it rather extensively, and let me just say this. It's not a question that we're afraid of. Obviously, when IES started, there was no pastor. My wife and I came. The church was doing well, and the church governance system we have is that decisions are made by deacons, men and women from the church who are committed to the church, committed to the mission of the church, who make those decisions. So there's been for many, many years, we have a plan that's in place, and it's called the PD gets hit by a bus plan. Yeah. So that's like, sudden death, a bus or whatever, and we know exactly what will happen if that happens. Now, over the last several years, in every single deacons meeting, or at least almost every deacons meeting, we discuss the issue of succession. Now, there's nothing wrong with it. I'm not offended by the discussion. I'm not offended by the question. I obviously can't stay here forever. It doesn't make sense, and it doesn't make sense for the church. So there's several things that we're trying to work out, okay? I have set as my absolute limit, when I turn 70, June 30th, 2026, I'm out the door, all right? No matter what. If the building has collapsed and the banks have collapsed and everything's in terrible shape, I'm still out the door. Because it's only with that assurance that the church can really move forward. I don't want to stay here forever. The number one problem with church succession is when the lead pastor won't leave. I love you guys. I love being your pastor. And the best thing for IES is to have a good person take my place. The sooner, the better. The next pastor you get will be younger, smarter, well, maybe not smarter, but younger. They'll have vision, probably a full head of hair, in a lot of different ways. And so there's a process in this. Now, as the deacons, we're reading the books. We've consulted with people who are involved in this process. Many of the deacons have gone through this own process in their own companies, and we're working our way through this. We have a lot of understandings that we've come to. We're moving in a process. In the appropriate time, the church will know more about it. The question is timing. Yeah, we have a time frame. Well, like I said, before I'm 70, this is definitely going to happen. The question has to do with who's going to take my place, how's that process all going to work out, and everything else. My daughter sent me something brilliant, right? She sent me something brilliant, and she said, Dad, the task for IES is not to replace you. The task is to find the right pastor to take the church forward in the next time and phase of the church. So we got to understand, you're not looking for somebody to replace me. You're looking for the person who will lead IES in the next stage of the development of the church. And so part of that whole process is to try and understand what those things will be like. I want you to know that I will be the one who absolutely believes in and supports the person chosen and will do everything I can to make it successful. And so it's important for all of us, and it's really important for me. Now, I told you all I wasn't going to let my daughter die for any of you, and that's true, yeah, or my wife. But I really do care what happens, and I believe God has this plan and purpose for this church in this city, and it involves your lives, and that plan and purpose also involves the person who will be the next pastor. So let's not use the word replace. Let's use the person who will be the next pastor. And I believe and I can trust the deacons to steward the future of this church. So feel free to talk to the deacons. Feel free to be involved. If you're not a voting member of IES, you're going to not be involved in this at all. You're just going to have to watch from the sideline. People say, why should I be involved as a voting member? Because if this is your church, you should be involved in some of that process. Great question. Great question. Pastor Dave, how do I deal with my teen who's always on his or her phone? Call me up and I'll talk to you about that. I think it's a fair thing to set some restrictions. I know of some families, for instance, where all the phones have to be put in one place in another part of the room when they have their meals together and things like that. If they're a teenager, you should have by this time established rules. If you haven't established rules, and it's okay to start late, it's okay to establish rules now, but you have to be consistent. If you're going to not let them talk on their phone, you have to be fair and not use yours according to the same kind of standards. Oh, this is really important. This is business. Well, their lives are really important to them. It's their whole world. Their friends are their whole world. And so understand that when you have that discussion, have a discussion. Maybe suggest that they set the standards and the rules. And that could be really helpful. So, yeah. What does the Bible say about lending money to a colleague if he or she doesn't intend to settle it soon? The Bible's pretty clear that it's not wise to lend money to other people. Yeah, I know a lot of people go and do partnerships and things like that in business, and I get that and I understand that. And my advice is any partnership should be very carefully, legally drawn up and legally set up. And people who want to borrow money from other people, I know a lot of people do, and I'm not upset about that, but I find it most often it destroys relationships. And so my first line is don't get into it. The Bible actually talks about lending money and it says it's not a good idea. And so if it's ex post facto, you've already loaned it to them, I think the best thing to do is pray for them to be able to sort it out. You want to answer that?
I think it's the same question on Halloween. I think if your children are just going just for the fun of it, I don't see the harm on it. If you are making sure they're clear on it's just something that you go because it's, kids like scary stuff, but that's just make sure it's clear that it's nothing spiritual or I don't even know if there is really such a thing as a haunted house, or is it
It's just something made up.
yeah, so
It's like going on a roller coaster. I don't understand the fascination with it. I've never found it interesting to be scared or to be grossed out by things, but I've done my share of making haunted houses when I was a kid. If you make them touch peeled grapes and tell them they're touching eyeballs and they're blindfolded, that's going to make them scared. And there's a couple of other good ones, but yeah. I just use wisdom. Pastor Dave, what's your take on approaching children who have gone through divorces? You mean the children have had a divorce from their spouses, so we're talking generally. I think that's where this question is coming from. Or do you mean they're the children whose parents have gone through divorce? Okay. In both situations, I would say both are traumatic. If your children have gone through divorce, they're adult children. They really need your help and support. They don't need to be told what they did right or wrong. They need to be brought to the Lord in prayer, and they need to be encouraged to draw close to the Lord. If you're talking about children and their parents have been divorced, that's really, really, really hard. And you need to really do everything that you can to help them, and mostly it needs spiritual help. There was an idea that was really popular in the States. I don't know about other places, but in the States it was really popular in the 60s and 70s, that it was better for a couple that were unhappy to get divorced because it'd be better for their kids to live with one happy parent than with two unhappy parents. And that particular counseling advice no longer exists because statistically kids are better raised in a home with two parents who are really unhappy with each other than to be raised by one parent. For number one parent alone is usually not happy. They're missing something in their life. And number two, kids are better raised by two parents. They are, even if one of the parents is not perfect or things like that. So if kids have gone through the trauma of divorce, wow, do everything you can. If they're your kids and it was your divorce, don't drag your kids into your divorce. Man, I hate that when I see kids, when they're with the mom, it's all about how bad dad was. When you're with the dad, it's all about how mom was. You bribe the kids, and well, if you let them stay with me, I'm going to take them to Bali. Well, if you let them stay with me, I'm going to take them to Singapore, and all this kind of stuff. Man, I hate that. You destroy your kids in order to get even with your spouse. Don't do that. Pastor Dave, what are your thoughts on Pastor's InStyle Instagram account that features pastor who wear expensive attires? My thought is I will never be featured on any of those kinds of things because I am like totally, I have no sense of style. When I was in Bible school, people thought I was actually colorblind because of the way I chose clothes that didn't match. And they'd say, you can't wear a polka dotted shirt with striped pants. And I would say, I just did. What do you mean I can't do it? Of course I can do it. My wife picks my clothes all the time. If you ever don't like something that I'm wearing, you can give her the blame for it. Some of those guys, I was asked a question last night because some of the people who show up on the Indonesian version of that are people who are pastors who are my friends. Honestly, folks, I don't care. There are some fashion things that I understand a little bit. I understand a little bit about the fashion world. Do you have an opinion? Should Tiffany sell themselves to LVMH for $14.5 billion? Will it be a good thing for the deal? I mean, those are the things I pay attention to, all right? But one of the guys got really raked over the coals. One of the pastors is a friend of mine because he wore a watch that cost $200,000. And people are saying a pastor shouldn't wear a watch that costs $200,000. Okay, and my watch doesn't cost anything like that, all right? So please, I wear a watch that basically all my watches were given to me. But if I can't be friends with a pastor who wears a $200,000 watch, let me ask you a question. If a pastor can't wear a $200,000 watch, can a Christian wear one? Is there a higher standard for a pastor than there would be for a Christian? If a pastor can't wear one of those watches, or I shouldn't be friends with one, should I be friends with Christians who wear $200,000 watches? Now, if Christians shouldn't wear $200,000 watches, should non-believers wear $200,000 watches? Okay? And if a non-believer wears a $200,000 watch, should I be a friend with them? So where are we going with this conversation? What does it have to do? A person is accountable to the congregation that they serve. If I show up with a $200,000 watch, you're going to ask me, Petey, what the heck are you doing? I just be confident. I'm never, ever, ever going to do that. I was asked a question once in a life group. It was in relationship to something that had happened in another church. And they said, Pastor Dave, what would you do if you were given this very expensive car? Your congregation raised the money and gave it to you as a gesture of their love to you. And I said, my hope is that my congregation would understand that I really don't care about those kind of things. My wife and I are treated very, very well by this church. We appreciate what we receive as our offering. And what we receive as our offering, we make our decisions about how we spend our money. But let the pastor who has an expensive watch or an expensive car, let them be accountable to their congregation. What's the point of us judging them? In fact, what's the point of us judging anybody? Would you guys feel happy and comfortable if I sat up here and looked and said, oh, that shirt that person's wearing, that's handmade silk. That must cost hundreds of dollars. Look at the bag. Look at the shoes. Look at all those things. Would you be comfortable? That'd be a terrible thing for me to do. It's a terrible thing going the other direction too. Yeah. One of the things that's really interesting is the issue of greed. Okay, greed is an issue of materialism, and it's wanting, wanting, wanting. Some of the greediest people are people who have everything, and some of the greediest people are people who have nothing. And they're both wrong. We are accountable to the Lord for what we do. Those friends of mine that are on the Indonesian version of Pastors InStyle, I haven't changed my opinion about them at all. And it's not going to. Why? Why would I care? And for those of you, last night I saw a couple of really nervous guys that were trying to hide their watches, I don't care what kind of watch you wear. If you like fancy watches and you want to spend that kind of money on a watch, God bless you. I hope it doesn't break. And I hope you have insurance. Now, if somebody asked me, Pastor Dave, did you ever buy an expensive fake watch? Look, if somebody's going to cut my arm off to get my watch, it's not worth it. If somebody's going to cut my arm off to get my watch, I want them to cut it off for the real thing, not the fake. I'd feel so bad. This watch I'm wearing now is about 5 or 6 years old, and it's a smart watch. It hooks up with my Android phone, and it costs about, well, it's not as smart as it used to be. But my other watch that also does the same thing is getting fixed. So I put this one back on. It costs about $250. Nobody's going to cut my hand off for $250. If I have a fake $200,000 watch, Somebody might cut my hand off, and I don't want to lose my hand for a $250 watch or $250,000 watch, and my hand's worth a lot more than that. So anyway, these are the last three questions. Okay.
You're on a roll.
I'm on a roll. It's easier to get on a roll when you're around. No reaction. Wow. Did you miss that? Anyway, how do we know when God speaks to us? It's really important for us to learn and train ourselves to hear and understand the voice of the Lord. In my experience, what really works well for me is when I think the Lord is speaking to me, I ask myself, how does this fit up with what Scripture says? And then I listen to things and I hear things and I ask myself, does this fit with Scripture? And then I say, okay, Lord, I think that this is your voice talking. And because I'm a Pentecostal, I need to put myself in situations where I feel like the Lord is saying something to me. And then I tell somebody, I believe the Lord is telling me this for you. I had that experience with somebody who's in the crowd today. I prayed for them and I wanted to ask the Lord for a word from the Lord. And I was hoping it would be a really exciting, spectacular word. And then maybe it wasn't so exciting and spectacular. But I'm confident that the Lord spoke to my heart. But I've learned over time to try and distinguish his voice. And so that's the beginning. You know, like that voice that says to you, like when somebody hurts you, and the voice that says, get even, that's not the Lord, okay? Because that's not what Scripture says. That's the best way to discern, yeah. Yeah, we have. We have advised somebody to get a divorce. If there's somebody in a marriage that's hurting the other person in marriage physically or abusing the kids, yes, absolutely, no doubt. If one of the partners is unfaithful in the marriage and they're serially unfaithful, in other words, you work with this unforgiveness, unfaithfulness, and then there's repentance, but then they're unfaithful again and unfaithful again. Yeah, we've advised divorce in those situations. We're not happy about it. Really good words that came to me from somebody. They said this: divorce is always a bad thing, but there are some things that are worse. And we don't, to allow a divorce, a marriage to stay together where one of the spouses beats the kids, no. Beats the spouse, no. We haven't advised people to get divorced. If IES only had 5 people in the congregation, will you still lead it? Do you know something I don't know? It would depend on who the 5 were. As long as my wife is one of the 5. Look, all right, let's be honest. Right now, we're running about 1,200, right? So in our peak in 2013, before Car Free Day, before the flood, before the fire, we averaged 1,370 something. So we are down about 10% from our peak, okay? In the meantime, we've planted churches, which are now, you add up all those churches, it's now bigger than what we were at our peak. So we've accomplished that goal. When I first came, my wife and I first came, IES was running about 100. And somebody asked us, Pastor Dave, what's your vision for IES? And I said, with all the honesty in my heart, I cannot imagine we can ever be bigger than 400. And it didn't take us long to pass 400. It has never been about the numbers. If there's 5 people left in IES, but God is still doing something in our hearts, no problem. It's not about the numbers. If there's 5,000 people, it's still not about the numbers. I posted something on my timeline, and it's really good. It's by an English theologian, Newbigging, and he may be not a theologian, but he's a writer anyway. And he said something: when you look through the book of Acts, or you look through the Bible, Paul never asked a church whether they were full, growing, or successful. He asked the church whether they were faithful. And our goal is to be a faithful church. My goal is for you to be faithful followers of Jesus Christ. And sometimes that means that we'll have bigger numbers, and sometimes we might have smaller numbers. People get confused where they're even supposed to go to church. Every week I get an email from somebody or a note, I went to UOB and you're not there anymore. You didn't tell me, And I said, well, never mind. I won't tell you what I said. You check your emails, but anyway. But it's not about that. I'm sorry for people who come and there's no service. I always want you, but it's not about how many of us come. And it never has been. It never will be and it never should be. You are not a crowd. We're the body of Christ, and that's the important thing to keep in perspective.